Hello and welcome back to Interpreting India. The beginning of 2021 was defined by a deadly second wave of coronavirus, precarious geopolitical relations, a contracting economy, and a rapidly evolving technological landscape. This season, we at Carnegie India are examining many of the challenges and opportunities that India will confront in the coming decade. I'm your host, Deep Pal, and this week, we are diving deep into major foreign policy events that occurred over the last few weeks and what they mean for India. The last month has been momentous for world politics with the conclusion of the first in-person Quad Leaders Summit, the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and the AUKUS Alliance, among other events. An important point of discussion has been Afghanistan, where the international community remains divided about how to engage the Taliban. On the other hand, the increased importance the United States has attached to the Indo-Pacific after its withdrawal from Afghanistan has led to the formation of the AUKUS Alliance as well as the Quad Summit. In this episode of Interpreting India, we analyze these major foreign policy events, India's contribution to them, and its role going forward. How will the events of last week determine the international community's response to the Taliban? And finally, what significance do these events hold for the future of Indian foreign policy? Joining us today for this discussion is Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. Ambassador Gautam Bambawale has worked in the Indian Foreign Service for 34 years between 1984 and 2018. During his career, he has been India's ambassador to Bhutan, Pakistan, and China. He was stationed in Washington, D.C. during the Indo-US nuclear deal. At the Ministry of External Affairs, he was Joint Secretary for East Asia from 2009 to 2014. He has had 17 years of experience dealing with China in various capacities. Ambassador Bambawale is currently Distinguished Professor, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Symbiosis International University in Pune. Ambassador Bambawale, welcome to Interpreting India. Let's start with a background. We have seen a flurry of diplomatic activity in the last few days. It started with the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It ended with the UN General Assembly. We still have the UN Climate Change Conference and the G20 meetings coming up later. But insofar as what we have seen happen so far, what would you say are the most important meetings that we have seen, both from India's perspective and as well as the mark that they will live on the times we live in?
Deep, first of all, let me say I'm delighted to be with you on this podcast. Thank you for inviting me. Second, if you permit me, I'd like to start with a little bit of a longer sort of background. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic or the Wuhan pandemic, as some people call it, and I prefer to call it that too, is a major event in international affairs because it has impacted every country across the globe. And this has led to a great churning, not only in geoeconomics, but also in geopolitics. And it is this churning that we have been witness to the last few days or the last few weeks, if you want to, including, of course, the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. Coming to the meetings which took place in the United States in the last few days, for which our Prime Minister Modi, visited that country, both New York as well as Washington, D.C. I think the most important of the meetings was, of course, the first in-person meeting of the Quad or the Quadrilateral Initiative, whatever you'd like to call it. I think this was important because here are four democracies from across the Indo-Pacific getting together to achieve certain objectives. And I think that those objectives have been brought out very clearly in the documents which have come out of that quadrilateral meeting, including an important thing such as vaccine maitri, as we in India call it, that is provision of vaccines to various countries, in supply chain reliability and resilience, including in chip manufacturing and so on and so forth, cyber security, etc. But I'll leave that to you to ask, and let me stop at this point of time.
Right. It's very interesting that you started with putting the Quad as the highlight of these meetings, because another curious development, in fact, that happened just before the Quad meetings was the AUKUS, which involves the UK, and is very different from what we have seen as the focus of the Quad countries, of Quad meetings. Now, at first glance, such an agreement seems to make sense because India, unlike others, is not a treaty partner of the US. At the same time, we have heard some commentary and a lot of talk about some being concerned about what this might mean for India's involvement with these powers that are moving ahead, both in the Quad, but also separately outside of the Quad, overall in the Indo-Pacific. What are your thoughts on whether it hinders or it bolsters the efforts to create an alternative to Chinese influence in the region?
That's a very interesting question, Deep, and thank you for asking that. And as you highlighted and pointed out, there have been any number of Indian observers, commentators, writers, authors who have questioned AUKUS vis-a-vis the Quad. And some of them have even gone so far as to say that it undermines the Quad. In my opinion, it is exactly the reverse. And my reasoning and logic for that argument is as follows. It is India which is averse to having any kind of alliance with other countries, including with the Quad countries. It is India which has always stated that the Quad is not and is not likely to be a military alliance. The Quad is a grouping, in our opinion, of 4 separate democracies from across the Indo-Pacific, and they aim at achieving certain objectives which have, again, as I said earlier, been highlighted in the documents which came out from the quadrilateral meeting in Washington, D.C. And these are very, very noble objectives. They're very broad-based objectives, and a lot of work will be required to achieve those objectives. Therefore, in my opinion, AUKUS is not something which undermines the Quad. AUKUS is a grouping of existing allies, which is Australia, the UK, and the US, getting together for a specific purpose. And therefore, I believe that AUKUS is something which complements the Quad or is complementary with the Quad. There are two developments which run parallel to each other and in fact complement each other. And even though the Quad is not a military alliance, the Quad countries do undertake military activities together. I think, therefore, I come to the conclusion that AUKUS is not something which undermines the Quad, but it actually supplements or complements the Quad.
Mm-hmm. Let's take that a little forward then, and let us into your thoughts about how this modifies or what should going forward India's behavior or role or approach be in the Indo-Pacific in a post-AUKUS world. For example, we know France has obviously not been happy with this entire development. It took a call from President Biden to the French president to finally have the ambassador, to come back to Washington, D.C., the French ambassador come back to Washington, D.C., who had been recalled. So do you see India playing a role through maybe the France, Australia, India trilateral that India has had a great deal of stake on, has been very bullish towards? Do you see India acting there, or generally in these various platforms that we are seeing operate? How does this modify how India operates?
Where the Quad itself is concerned, Deep, what I think is that the other 3 countries, the other 3 nations which are involved in the Quad, namely the United States, Japan, and Australia, they are all treaty partners or treaty allies with each other. And therefore, the new element in the Quad is India. And therefore, India has been doing things over the past few years which help to complement the work of the other democracies in this part of the world. And I feel that we should continue doing that, whether it is in the area of maritime security, where we are paying so much importance that we, even as the chair of the UN Security Council for the month of August, we focused on this subject laser sharp and got all the members of the UN Security Council to discuss it. So we need to continue doing things like this, including the vaccine Maitri program, which is now, the export of vaccines from India is now resuming, as Prime Minister Modi declared in his UN speech, as well as in Washington, D.C. So we need to continue doing these things which will help the common good. And here I would just like to point out that India's approach to foreign policy is slightly different from other nations and other nation states. While we do promote our own national interests, we also believe that the world is one family. And therefore, it is important to assist others within our capabilities and capacities in order to increase our own welfare and to protect our own interests. This has come out very beautifully in the book that our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has written recently, and which has become so popular across the world. So I think all these elements are things which we will continue to promote, continue to do in the coming years and coming months. To take your specific question about France, France is a very, very important partner for India. France has a stake in the Indo-Pacific. They are a presence in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, I believe that India will continue to work with France, just as we work with the Quad countries in ensuring that a rules-based order will prevail in the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Right. If we can go back a couple of weeks before the Quad meeting, the Prime Minister participated in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting via video conference. Now, we also have a continuing strategic partnership with Russia. But globally, we are seeing these lines being drawn, these lines in the sand, they're being drawn very hard, right? On one end, you have, if you will, Russia, China. And on the other side, you have the Quad countries, many Western democracies, and so on. So given this, how difficult do you think the balancing act is going to be? I mean, for example, ahead of the US-India meetings, there was a lot of talk about the S-400 issue, right? India is supposed to be getting delivery of them by the end of 2021, and that might force the United States' hand in bringing about CAATSA sanctions. And that is obviously an issue that the two countries are talking about and trying to find a way around.
You have asked a very pertinent question, Deep, and a very precise question. I think this is going to be and continues to be a bit of a challenge for Indian diplomacy, for Indian foreign policy, which is we have a very, very strong relationship with Russia, and we need to maintain and, in fact, expand that relationship with Russia, this strategic partnership with Russia. In order to do so, we need to go beyond the government-to-government interaction, which is already deep and broad between our two countries. We need to expand this to business, of course, to have greater trade and investment flows between our two countries. And this is something which the government of India is well aware of. This is why Prime Minister Modi and other ministers from our government are constantly participating in the Vladivostok Forum, which helps to promote trade and investment with that part of Russia. And we also need to continue to expand people-to-people ties. And it is only when we are successful at giving greater resilience, to giving greater breadth and depth to business as well as people-to-people ties, that India-Russia relations will then begin to really soar, just like India United States relations are doing at the present. So this is, of course, a tight walk on a rope, on a string, as you have rightly pointed out and described. But I think India needs to do this. I think Indian diplomacy has the capabilities and the capacities to do this. We need to work on the Russia partnership, on the Russia strategic relationship, and we need to keep Russia on our side of things, even as we continue to build our relations with the other democracies of the world, like the US, Japan, Australia, France, the UK, etc. It is a tightrope walk. There's no doubt about that. But I believe that we have the abilities and the capabilities to do this successfully. And we will see that in the coming months and coming years.
If I can take one part of your comment where you say that, it's going to be a tightrope walk. How do you see India walking that tightrope walk? Because positions have hardened from where they were even a few years ago. And I mean, I will eventually come to Afghanistan, but developments like Afghanistan and the assertiveness that we see from China and various other issues, coronavirus is something you mentioned. These are making more and more difficult or trickier for a country like India to be on both sides and maintain the relationships that it has nurtured over years with these various players.
You are right. You're not wrong. You're absolutely right there. And therefore, it is a challenge, as I said earlier. But I believe that if we give greater ballast to the India-Russia relationship in terms of business, and there the government will have to step in and ensure that Indian businesses look at Russia. The Russian government will have to step in and ensure that doing business with Russia is safer, easier, and there are adequate returns in carrying out such business. But we need to provide further ballast to this India-Russia relationship. It cannot remain just a government-to-government relationship, even if that entails cooperation in areas like nuclear energy, space, and other areas, of course, defense. But we need to go beyond that in order to provide ballast to this relationship, to provide depth to this relationship. And the way to go is to expand the people-to-people, the business-to-business links between our two countries. It is going to be difficult. I accept that. But I think we need to move in the direction that I'm suggesting, which is to move the relationship from a pure government-to-government kind of relationship to a more people-oriented, a business-oriented relationship.
Mm-hmm. Talking about business-oriented relationships, Ambassador Bambawale, now in the previous few conversations that India has had with the United States, more so during the Trump administration, we saw a lot of focus on trade, which is something that was absent this time, at least to the same degree. We saw a lot more conversation on strategic issues. Going forward, what would you say? What would you think are the few pillars on which this relationship will stand? I mean, of course, we already have a very wide-ranging relationship, including people-to-people relationships with the United States that you mentioned. But what do you see as being the focus areas, at least in the short term, in the India-US relationship?
No, absolutely. I agree with you that there are several pillars of this relationship. The people-to-people relationship or the people-to-people ties are very, very important. The Indo-American community in the United States is very important. There is the political relationship is strong and will continue to remain strong. The defense relationship is going great and will continue to move forward. You're absolutely right. If there is any kind of weak link in India-US relations, it's on the trade and investment side. It's not a weak link. It's expanding in scope and strength. We need more trade. We need more investment from amongst our two countries, and we will have to focus on that aspect as we move ahead. I believe that the two governments are working on some kind of early trade deal, etc. It won't be a full-scale FTA or a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, but at least it will have some elements of an early deal, of an early free trade agreement. I think that will be very, very important. I think also that this idea of the STEM scholarships, which has come out of the the quadrilateral meeting in Washington, D.C. is something which is very, very exciting because it will enable people in India, that is young students in the STEM areas in India, to not only participate in US universities and go to US universities for their studies, but it will also enable them to interact with similar scholars from the other three countries, which is Japan, Australia, and the United States. And that, I think, is a very interesting, very exciting opportunity to me, especially as we move ahead into areas of new and critical technologies. And this will probably help in developing, inventing, innovating such technologies. So these are some of the aspects of India-US ties which are going to be important. The relationship is strong, but we need to continually work at it in order to make it remain strong.
Mm-hmm. Right, but at the same time, there are certain issues on which India and the United States, we don't really see eye to eye, right? Afghanistan being one of those, right? India continues to have an abiding security interest in what happens in Afghanistan, and if you look at the United States, the withdrawal, it clearly indicates a different direction, at least for now, that the US wants to go in its foreign policy in the region. Now, given this background, and the fact that counterterrorism continues to be an umbrella that brings India and United States together, what do you see as the future of any kind of cooperation on Afghanistan, the possibility of such cooperation on Afghanistan in the coming months and years?
Absolutely right, Deep. No two countries can have exactly the same interests. There may be some interests which are common, but there may be some interests which are divergent. And that's the case, at least at the present, where Afghanistan is concerned, between Delhi and Washington, between New Delhi and Washington. But at the same time, I would like to say that even the United States, even Washington, looks upon this aspect of no bases, no financing, no support for terrorism out of Afghanistan as being very, very important. Because if that were to happen, if Afghanistan were to slide into or slip into the previous kind of situation that existed between 1996 and 2001, then not only would India become a target of that kind of international terrorism, but who knows, the United States could also become a target for such international terrorism, as happened on 9/11 so many 20 years ago. So I think we have some common interest in ensuring that Afghanistan continues to develop as a multi-ethnic society, which is represented in its government by people across the whole of society in Afghanistan, that Afghanistan does not slip back into the kind of situation that existed between 96 and 2001, and that it continues to make progress. And I think that, while today we may not have diametrically identical interests in Afghanistan, that in the coming months and coming years, that there will be an overlapping of common interests between India and the US where Afghanistan is concerned, basically to ensure that there is no resurgence of the kind of situations which led to 9/11 so many years ago. So even though it looks at present as if our interests don't completely converge where Afghanistan is concerned, there are elements which will see India and the US working together even on this subject, which you mentioned.
That's interesting because, and I will come back to the question of Afghanistan in a minute, but before that, when we talk about the similar interest that India and the US may have in countering terrorism in the region, the question of Pakistan obviously immediately comes up, right? And I think there are a few people in Washington, D.C. that are not convinced about the role of Pakistan in leading Taliban to the place that they are today. Their advisory role in the current administration in Afghanistan, the Taliban are trying to get their hands on. Now, where do you see the Pakistan question or Pakistan's role as a sponsor of terror, that question coming between India and the US? Obviously, the US has its limitations. It needs a partner and an ally in the region through which they can hope to exert some kind of control or have some kind of leverage over Taliban. We know that hasn't really worked very well all the time. But surely this is something that the two countries will, by two countries I mean India and the United States, will try to come closer on. But how do they do that?
There is a lot of heartburn and questioning within the United States itself, Deep, as you know better than I do, on this entire question of how Pakistan has played both sides against the middle. And the United States was well aware of it over the past 20 years, ever since 2001, right up till its withdrawal a few weeks ago. the United States was well aware of the role that Pakistan was playing, including giving the Taliban, all kinds of support and succor and so on. Why they didn't do anything vis-a-vis Pakistan is a question that only people who have been in American administrations over these last 20 years can inform us and tell us. I am completely surprised that they didn't take action because, the situation we have in Afghanistan today, has occurred because of this particular fact. And I believe the Americans should have focused on it laser sharp and should have attended to it. But anyway, that's all in the past. Looking forward and going ahead, as far as Pakistan is concerned, as long as it doesn't, if Pakistan can abjure providing support to terrorists and terror groups which are based in Pakistan and which aim at India, aim at creating terrorist incidents in India, we'll be very happy with that. Of course, we don't see that happening immediately, but we will continue to work on ensuring and seeing that Pakistani terror groups are not able to harm India and India's interests and Indians themselves in the coming weeks and coming months. So we will continue to take care of ourselves. You know that the number of terror modules have been indicted and in the last few weeks. That I think is a good development. There has been some action by the Indian Army on infiltration attempts from across the border. They will, of course, continue. We will continue to be on our guard, and we need to be on our guard. And we will also work with other countries, including the United States, in countering terrorism and international terrorism. So I think it's a subject on which there is convergence, even though our interests are not absolutely identical.
Ambassador Bambawale, if you can go back on the question of Afghanistan, kind of talk about the UN General Assembly as well, because as expected, there was a lot of conversation about the state of affairs in Afghanistan, the Taliban and so on in the UNGA. Days before it started, we saw the Taliban nominating Suhail Shaheen as the UN envoy, who has still not been accepted, and it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. I was curious about your thoughts on how you see the UN, the role that it can play as the Taliban try for legitimacy from world bodies.
Deep, I believe that, the fact that till today, and we are at the end of September 2021, it's been several weeks since this interim government of the Taliban was announced with the individual names, etc. But till today, not a single country has recognized this as the government of Afghanistan as yet. The United Nations has not accepted, as you rightly said, their nominee to be the representative at the UN of Afghanistan. So this shows the deep feeling of unease and disquiet that exists all over the world regarding this resurgence of the Taliban as the government in charge of that country. And this is why many major countries across the world are insisting on a representative government where representation of minority groups, including women, are included in the government. So people are going to be careful about how they move ahead with this particular dispensation in Afghanistan. And I think that is absolutely the right thing to do, because I don't believe that the Taliban has reformed, or this is a 2.0 or a reformed Taliban which is in power in Afghanistan. I believe that their basic ideology continues to remain the same based on the Sharia law, and therefore I do not see any change in this avatar of the Taliban as compared to that in the period of 1996 to 2001. During this period, they may have become a little more polished, I believe. So they're playing this game quite adroitly and carefully, of course, under guidance from other parts of the world. and you know what I mean. But I think it is absolutely correct for both India as well as other countries and nations across the globe to be circumspect about how we move ahead in Afghanistan, and especially in the process of either interacting or recognizing the Taliban government in Afghanistan.
That's very interesting, because one of the concerns has also been that while countries may shy away from officially recognizing the new regime in Afghanistan, certain efforts to have some kind of unofficial recognition from various parties is already underway. And a concern is that, eventually aid will start trickling in, or unofficial recognitions will start slowly coming in. And before you know it, business will be on its way to being as usual with and countries.
You make a very interesting point. I'm not saying that either India or other countries, because you should not interact or have exchanges with the Taliban government in Afghanistan, because they do control the country. But I think where recognizing that government is concerned, we need to be, just interacting with them is not the same as recognizing the government.
Right, of course.
There should be a little bit of circumspection in this whole process of recognizing the government. And as far as interactions with the Taliban are concerned in Afghanistan, I know that most countries will keep this to the minimum, at least in the next few months, because their immediate interests in Afghanistan are now today quite limited. And so I make a distinction between interacting or having exchanges with the Taliban and recognizing the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan.
No, absolutely, point taken. But what I was coming at is that, as countries begin to interact, not officially recognized, but start having limited relations with the regime, what are the ways in which they can continue to have leverage over this regime, especially, and what role could India potentially play in this, considering its position in the UNSC currently as a non-permanent member, and the fact that what happens in Afghanistan, few countries are as affected as India is with what happens in Afghanistan.
No, you're absolutely right there, Deep. And particularly, I would like to point to the kind of economic projects that India has done in Afghanistan over the past couple of decades. There have been projects which have helped develop the country. There have been projects which have brought the fruits of economic development to large swaths of people in Afghanistan. We have undertaken many of these small development projects which immediately benefit and have direct benefits to smaller communities in Afghanistan in different parts of the country. And I think that there is a good understanding even amongst the Taliban that one of the countries which could actually be relevant in the whole process of economic development and growth and social progress also in Afghanistan is India. But we must be very transactional where this is concerned. We should ensure that our interests are completely understood and met by the Taliban. And our interests basically are that there should be no terrorism aimed at us from Afghanistan. That's point number one. And point number two is that our projects, etc., should be safe, and we can test the waters by resuming a little bit of this project aid that we have had over the past 20 years. That's as far as India is concerned. I believe that other countries will also very broadly follow this modus vivendi. I believe that most countries across the world will first provide perhaps humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan and then move to other economic assistance, but they will do it in bits and dribbles so that they're able to pull back in case the Taliban do not show that they are a relatively reformed Taliban, or let me put it this way, that this kind of reform is forced upon them. because as I said earlier, I don't believe they've reformed, but it'll have to be forced upon them, especially, where things like education for girls is concerned and the status of women is concerned, etc., etc. So I think that's the way to proceed ahead, Deep.
Right. So, Ambassador Bambawale, you have been an observer and a participant in India's foreign policy for the longest time. Now, based on India's policy interventions in these various events that we discussed over the last week or a little more, how do you see India approaching the other major multilateral initiatives, meetings that are coming up in the rest of the year? We talked about the climate change conference and the G20. What is the indication that we get in the direction in which India will want to take the conversation in these platforms?
An excellent question, Deep. Very, very broad. It will take a long time to answer if I go into every specific aspect. So let me do it at a macro level. But I think, today India is looked upon by the rest of the international community as a very, very responsible player at the global level. So what India thinks, what India does is important. Where climate change is concerned, for example, we are now working with other countries. We see this as a major problem. Global warming is real. We have accepted it. We are moving towards, we're doing things which will help in reducing global warming, or at least controlling the rise in global temperatures. So the point I'd like to make at a macro level is that India today is a very important country in the global landscape. And we will work on all these subjects, all of them on global issues with other groups of countries to protect and promote not just India's interests, but the interests of mankind as a whole. And there, I think, Deep, India plays a very special role, because all other nations in the world are focused laser sharp on their own national interests and promote their own national interests. But India has an approach where, we believe that the world is one family and we all either rise together or sink together. And therefore, this approach is what is required on some of these global, if not all of these global issues. And therefore, India will continue to be an important player and will be a very important player on all these issues, in the resolution of these issues as we move ahead. The fact that we are currently, over the next year or two now, 2021 is coming to an end, but 2022 also, a member of the UN Security Council will only help us in achieving these goals and objectives. Of course, as I said, along with other important players and members of the international community. So I see, that India's position in the Committee of Nations actually having gone up several notches over the last few years. I would also say that in order for India to be able to help with global issues, we need to focus domestically and inward. And by that, I mean that we have to grow our own economy. We need to have fast-paced economic growth of 7 to 8% per annum over an extended period of 20 or 25 years. And if we are able to do that successfully, then, of course, India will be amongst the ranks of, the first few nations in the world, but our responsibilities will also increase along with that. I've answered your question at a very holistic and broad level, Deep. I hope, I hope that answers some of your questions.
It does, sir. But as we conclude, one last question then, what do you see are the major obstacles as India attempts to achieve these goals, these foreign policy goals, or in the next few years?
I think the obstacles, as Prime Minister Modi had put in his UNGA speech, where he spoke about a regressive mindset, I think the obstacles are not a regressive mindset, but the obstacles are in not believing in ourselves, that is in India itself, in our nation, etc. I hope that we, rather than having a negative outlook, that we can move ahead with a positive, proactive outlook, that it is possible for India, even within its open democratic system, to achieve the many objectives and goals that we have set for ourselves, not only in domestic economic policy and domestic policy, but also in international policy.
Right. Ambassador Bambawale, thank you very much for talking with Interpreting India today.
Thank you, Deep.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening and see you next time.